May 8, 1945. The war in Europe had ended hours earlier, but no one had told the women locked inside the freight car. Hildegard pressed her cheek against the wooden slats, feeling the splinters dig into her skin. The air inside was thick and rotten, a soup of sweat and sickness and something worse that she could not name. 12 days they had been sealed in this darkness. 12 days without food. Water came only when rain leaked through the cracks above, and they would press their cracked lips to the walls, tongues scraping wood to catch the moisture. Outside, through the gaps, she could see the countryside rolling past in fragments. Green fields, blue sky, a world that continued to exist while they slowly disappeared. The train had stopped moving 3 days ago. At first, they thought rescue had come. They screamed until their voices failed, hammering fists against the door until their hands bled, but no one answered. The silence outside was complete, broken only by birdsong and wind. Hildegard wondered if the guards had simply walked away when the surrender came, forgetting that human beings were locked inside these cars, or perhaps they remembered and did not care. Either possibility seemed equally true, equally terrible. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her face. It had been so long since she had seen a mirror. Her fingers traced the bones of her cheeks, sharper now than she remembered. The skin felt like paper stretched over a frame. Beside her, Annalisa lay curled on the floor, her breathing shallow and irregular. 3 women had already died. Their bodies remained in the corner, wrapped in the coats of the living, because there was nothing else to do with them. The smell was unbearable at first. Now it was simply part of the air they breathed. To understand how these women came to be locked in a freight car, starving in the spring sunshine of a liberated Europe, one must step back through the architecture of war and ask what happens to female prisoners when empires collapse. The women in this train were not soldiers, though some had worn uniforms. They were clerks and nurses, radio operators and administrators, cooks and translators. They were the infrastructure of the Third Reich's war machine, the women who kept the massive bureaucracy of conquest functioning. When the Allied armies swept across Germany in the final months of 1945, they captured not just soldiers, but thousands of these auxiliary personnel. Women who had served in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Women's Labour Service, women who had worked in munitions factories or military hospitals, women who had done nothing more than answer telephones in Wehrmacht offices. The British forces advancing into northern Germany in April and May 1945 found themselves responsible for enormous numbers of prisoners. The camps were overflowing. The roads were clogged with displaced persons, refugees, and surrendering military units. The entire administrative apparatus of occupied Germany was in chaos. In this confusion, groups of female prisoners were sometimes loaded onto freight trains and transported toward designated prisoner collection points. These movements were often disorganized, poorly documented, and subject to the same breakdowns in communication and supply that affected all aspects of the occupation in those first chaotic weeks. Hildegard had been arrested on April 23rd, 2 weeks before the final surrender. She had worked as a secretary in a Luftwaffe administrative office in Hamburg, typing requisition forms and filing reports. When British tanks appeared in the streets, she had been rounded up with dozens of other women from her building. They were marched to a schoolyard and held there for 3 days without information. No one told them what would happen. No one asked their names or what they had done. They were simply bodies to be processed, sorted, moved from place to place, according to some larger logic that remained invisible to them. On April 26th, they were loaded into freight cars. 70 women in a space meant for 40. The door slid shut and darkness fell. Through the walls, they could hear other cars being loaded, the sound of boots on gravel, shouted orders in English. Then the train lurched forward and they began to move. For the first 2 days, the journey seemed routine. The train would stop occasionally, and guards would open the door to pass in buckets of water and loaves of bread. The portions were small but sufficient. The women organized themselves, rationing the food, taking turns sitting near the door where the air was slightly fresher. They told themselves this was temporary. They would arrive at a camp, be registered, and then released. The war was clearly ending. Surely they would be home soon. But on the third day, the train stopped and did not start again. Hours passed. The women called out but received no answer. The door remained locked. Night came and they huddled together in the darkness, trying to conserve warmth. Morning brought no change. The water was gone. The food was gone. Panic began to move through the car like an infection. Some women wept. Others became silent and withdrawn. Hildegard found herself thinking with strange clarity about the mechanics of their situation. They were locked inside a wooden box. The door was barred from outside. Even if they could break through the walls, they had no idea where they were. They could be anywhere. They could be in the middle of a battlefield, or a forest, or a bombed city. They could be surrounded by hostile forces, or abandoned in empty countryside. Without information, action was meaningless. The Allied advance into Germany in 1945 was the largest military operation in human history up to that point. Millions of men and thousands of vehicles moved across a landscape already devastated by years of war. The logistics of this movement were staggering. Armies needed fuel and ammunition and food. They needed communications and intelligence and medical support. They needed to process prisoners, govern occupied territory, maintain supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles to ports and depots. In this enormous machinery, individual freight cars could easily be forgotten. A train could be shunted onto a siding to clear the main line for military traffic and then simply left there when the unit responsible for it moved forward. Papers could be lost, orders could fail to arrive. Guards could be reassigned and forget to mention the cargo they were supposed to be watching. This is what happened to the train carrying Hildegard and the other women. On April 29th, the train had been moved to a siding near the town of Lüneburg to allow military traffic to pass. The guards were drawn from a transportation unit that received orders to move south that same afternoon. In the confusion of departure, no one thought to mention the freight cars full of prisoners sitting on the siding. The cars were not marked. They looked like any other rolling stock. When the new unit arrived to manage the rail yard, they had no record of prisoners. The cars sat undisturbed. Inside, time became elastic and strange. Without light, the women could not distinguish day from night except by the temperature shifts and the sounds that filtered through the walls. They heard trucks passing on nearby roads. They heard aircraft overhead. Once they heard voices very close, men speaking English, and they screamed until their throats were raw, but the voices moved away and did not return. Thirst became the central fact of existence. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. Rain saved them on the fourth day. It fell steadily for hours, and water seeped through gaps in the roof and walls. They caught it in their hands, in their mouths, soaking their clothes and wringing them out to drink the moisture. It tasted of rust and wood rot, but it was water. Hunger followed more slowly. The body consumes itself in stages. First the glycogen reserves in the liver and muscles, then fat tissue, then protein, breaking down muscle to fuel the brain and heart. The women grew weaker day by day. Movement became difficult. Conversation became sparse. They lay in the darkness and felt their bodies changing, becoming lighter and more fragile, as if they were being slowly erased. Annalisa, who had been a nurse, explained the process in a whisper. She said the body could last 3 weeks or more without food if it had water. She said they would not starve immediately. But her voice lacked conviction. She was describing a textbook scenario, not the reality of 70 women locked in a sealed box with no medicine, no sanitation, no hope of rescue. The first death came on the 7th day. Frau Richter, an older woman who had worked in a payroll office, simply did not wake up. They discovered her in the morning, cold and still. There was a moment of shock and grief, and then a terrible practical question. What should they do with the body? They had no tools, no way to bury her. The door was still locked. In the end, they moved her to the corner and covered her with coats. They said a prayer. Then they tried not to think about it. The second death came 2 days later. A young woman named Gisela who had been sick since before they boarded the train. She had complained of stomach pain and fever. In the freight car, with no medicine and no help, the illness consumed her. She died quietly in the night, and in the morning they moved her body to the corner with Frau Richter. The smell of decay began to fill the car. Some women tied cloth around their faces to filter the air. Others simply endured it, too weak to care. By the 10th day, coherent thought was becoming difficult. Hildegard found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind sliding between memory and hallucination. She dreamed of her mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking. She dreamed of swimming in a lake, cold water on her skin. She dreamed she was already dead, and this darkness was the afterlife, an eternal waiting in a wooden box. When she opened her eyes, she could not always remember where she was or why. The present had become indistinguishable from nightmare. The historical record of prisoner treatment in the immediate aftermath of World War II is extensive but uneven. The major trials at Nuremberg documented the systematic atrocities of the Nazi regime. The treatment of Allied prisoners by German forces was well documented, but the treatment of German prisoners by Allied forces received less attention, particularly in cases that fell into grey zones of confusion rather than clear wrongdoing. Thousands of German military prisoners died in Allied custody in 1945 and 1946, most from disease and malnutrition in overcrowded camps. The causes were not deliberate cruelty, but rather the overwhelming scale of the problem and the collapse of infrastructure. The victorious armies found themselves responsible for feeding and housing millions of prisoners at a time when Europe's entire economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. Medicine was scarce. Shelter was scarce. Priorities were debated. Were German prisoners entitled to the same rations as Allied soldiers? Should resources be diverted from displaced persons and liberated concentration camp survivors to feed former members of the Wehrmacht? These questions had moral and practical dimensions. The Allies had discovered the concentration camps. They had seen the evidence of industrial murder and systematic starvation. The instinct to show compassion to German prisoners was complicated by the knowledge of what German forces had done. At the same time, the laws of war were clear. Prisoners were entitled to humane treatment. Deliberate starvation or neglect was prohibited. The Allied forces generally attempted to honour these obligations, but the gap between policy and reality was often enormous. A directive from headquarters might order adequate rations for prisoners, but if the food did not exist or the transportation network had collapsed, the directive was meaningless. On May 8th, the day Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces, British military police were conducting a routine inspection of a rail yard near Lüneburg. They were looking for abandoned military equipment and checking that the area was secure. One of the sergeants noticed several freight cars sitting on a distant siding. They appeared old and unused. Something about them seemed wrong. He walked closer and heard a sound, a weak tapping from inside one of the cars. He called for bolt cutters, and they opened the door. The smell hit them first. Even hardened soldiers stepped back, gagging. Then they saw what was inside. Women, dozens of them. Skeletal, filthy, barely conscious. Some were lying motionless on the floor. Some were trying to crawl toward the light. The bodies of 3 women lay in the corner, partially decomposed. The scene was so shocking that for a moment the soldiers simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Then training took over. They called for medics. They began lifting women out of the car, carrying them to the grass beside the tracks. They opened water bottles and held them to cracked lips. They radioed for ambulances and medical supplies. The medical personnel who arrived found conditions that resembled the concentration camps they had been liberating for weeks. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, infections. Several women were unconscious, most were too weak to stand. The doctors began triage, identifying those in immediate danger and those who could survive with food and water. Hildegard was among those classified as critical. She was lifted onto a stretcher and carried to an ambulance. She retained only fragments of memory from this period: the overwhelming brightness of sunlight, the sensation of grass under her hands, the taste of water, voices speaking English in urgent tones, the feeling of movement as the ambulance drove away from the rail yard. She woke 3 days later in a British field hospital. She was lying in a clean bed with white sheets. An IV line ran into her arm. When she tried to sit up, a nurse appeared and gently pushed her back down, speaking words she did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. Rest. You are safe now. Over the following weeks, Hildegard slowly regained strength. The doctors explained that she had been very close to death. Her body weight had dropped to dangerous levels. Her organs had been shutting down. If the rescue had come even a day later, she might not have survived. Of the 70 women in the freight car, 3 had died during the 12 days of confinement. 5 more died in the hospital in the days following rescue. The rest survived, though many bore permanent damage to their kidneys, hearts, and other organs from the extended starvation. The British military conducted an investigation into how the freight car had been forgotten. The findings were inconclusive. No single person was found to be responsible. The breakdown had occurred at multiple points. The original transport unit had failed to properly document the prisoners. The rail yard had no record of the cars. Communication between units had been poor. The report concluded that the incident was the result of administrative confusion during the chaotic final days of the war rather than deliberate neglect. No one was prosecuted. The matter was filed away. For Hildegard, the experience marked a division in her life between before and after. She returned to Hamburg in June 1945 and found her city in ruins. Her apartment building had been destroyed in the bombing. Her family was scattered. She lived for months in a displaced persons camp, then found work with the British Occupation Administration, translating documents. She married in 1948 and had 3 children. She lived a long life, dying in 1998 at the age of 76. But she never spoke about the 12 days in the train car, except once, late in life, to her daughter. She said that what she remembered most was not the hunger or the thirst or the fear, but the feeling of being erased, of becoming invisible, of realizing that she could die and no one would notice or care, that her existence or non-existence made no difference to the world outside the wooden walls. The freight car incident was one of thousands of small tragedies that occurred in the spring of 1945 as Europe emerged from war. Most left no record. The women survived and returned to their lives. The soldiers who found them moved on to other duties. The investigation was filed and forgotten. Historians writing about the end of World War II focus on the large events: the surrender ceremonies, the Nuremberg trials, the beginning of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan. The story of 70 women starving in a train car does not fit neatly into these narratives. It is neither heroic nor villainous. It is simply what happens when systems collapse and individual lives become invisible to the machinery of history. Yet perhaps this is precisely why such stories matter. The grand narratives of war focus on nations and armies and ideologies. They tell us about strategic decisions and political consequences. But war is experienced at the level of individuals. It is hunger and thirst and fear. It is lying in darkness and wondering if anyone remembers you exist. It is the moment when the door finally opens and light floods in, and you realize you have survived something you thought would kill you. These experiences do not make for simple moral lessons. Hildegard was not a hero or a victim in any straightforward sense. She was a woman who worked in an office and got caught in the collapse of the regime she served. Her suffering was not the result of a single evil decision, but rather the accumulated weight of 1,000 small failures, oversights, and moments of indifference. The other women from the train car scattered across Germany after their release. Some emigrated to other countries. Some remained in the British and American zones. A few returned to what became East Germany. They wrote no memoirs. They formed no associations. They did not speak publicly about what happened to them. This silence is understandable. Germany, in the late 1940s and 1950s, was focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, on forgetting the war. Former members of Nazi organizations faced suspicion and hostility. Claiming victimhood was complicated when so many others had suffered more. The women who survived the train car simply absorbed the experience into themselves and continued living. But memory persists even in silence. Hildegard's daughter remembered her mother's story and told it to her own children. The British soldiers who opened the freight car told their families. The doctors who treated the women wrote brief notes in medical journals. These fragments of memory circulated quietly, never becoming part of the official history, but never quite disappearing either. They remind us that history is not only what gets written in textbooks, it is also the accumulation of individual experiences, the moments that change people even when they change nothing else. The train car itself was likely scrapped for metal in the reconstruction period. The rail yard at Lüneburg was rebuilt and expanded. The town became prosperous in the decades after the war. Today, nothing marks the location where the freight car sat for 12 days in May 1945. The grass grows, trains pass, the earth has absorbed the event and moved on, but the story remains, carried forward by the thin thread of testimony, a reminder of what human beings can endure and what they can forget. In the end, what the freight car reveals is not a simple truth about good and evil, but something more uncomfortable and more important. It shows us how easily human lives can become invisible, how systems designed to manage and protect can fail in ordinary, unremarkable ways, how suffering can occur not because anyone intended it, but because no one was paying attention. The women in the train car were not murdered. They were not tortured, they were simply forgotten. And this forgetting, this administrative oversight, this failure of attention brought them as close to death as any deliberate cruelty could have. The paradox of modern war is that it is both highly organized and deeply chaotic. Armies move according to precise plans, but those plans constantly collide with reality. Orders are issued, but not received. Units are reassigned and lose track of their responsibilities. Paperwork is lost. Communication breaks down. In this chaos, the vulnerable fall through the cracks. The freight car incident was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of the larger breakdown that occurs when industrial societies turn their full power toward destruction. The same railroads that moved armies and supplies also moved prisoners. The same bureaucracies that coordinated battles also processed displaced persons. When these systems failed, people died not because anyone chose to kill them, but because the machinery of care and protection simply stopped working. Hildegard survived because someone noticed. Because a sergeant walking through a rail yard heard a sound and decided to investigate. Because bolt cutters were available and medics were nearby and hospitals had beds and supplies. 100 small contingencies aligned in her favour. But they could just as easily have not aligned. The train could have been in a different rail yard. The sergeant could have been less attentive. The medics could have arrived too late. Survival, in the chaos of 1945, was largely a matter of chance. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the freight car. That whether you lived or died often depended not on your choices or your character, but on whether the right person happened to be in the right place at the right moment. Yet there is also something else in this story, something that resists the logic of pure chance and indifference. The women in the freight car did not simply wait to die. They organized themselves, they rationed water, they cared for the sick, they covered the dead with what dignity they could manage. Annalisa explained the science of starvation, giving the others knowledge that might help them endure. Hildegard pressed her face to the gaps in the wall, maintaining connection with the world outside, even when it seemed the world had forgotten them. These small acts of will and care did not save them, but they kept them human. They transformed passive suffering into something more active and more meaningful. In this sense, the women in the train car were not merely victims, they were actors in their own story, making choices that mattered even if those choices could not alter the fundamental situation. The British soldiers who opened the door also made a choice. They could have walked away, told themselves it was not their responsibility, reported the matter and let someone else handle it. But they did not. They stayed, they called for help, they carried women to safety, they did what the moment required of them. This too is part of the story, that in the midst of breakdown and indifference, individuals still have the capacity to act, to notice, to care. The system failed, but people did not. Or at least, some people did not. 70 years later, the world is very different. The ruins of Hamburg have been rebuilt into a prosperous modern city. The generation that fought World War II has largely passed away. The ideologies that drove the conflict have been discredited or transformed. But the fundamental questions raised by the freight car incident remain relevant. How do we prevent human lives from becoming invisible? How do we build systems that do not fail in catastrophic ways? How do we maintain attention and care in the face of overwhelming complexity? These are not questions with simple answers. They are tensions that every society must navigate, knowing that failure is always possible and its consequences are borne by the most vulnerable. The story of the train car is ultimately a story about the fragility of human dignity, about how quickly it can be stripped away when systems fail and attention lapses. But it is also a story about resilience, about the capacity to endure unendurable things, about the small acts of will and care that keep us human even in the darkest circumstances. Hildegard survived 12 days in that wooden box and then lived another 53 years. She raised children and worked and laughed and loved. The freight car did not define her life, though it marked it. She carried the memory inside her, a dark space she rarely entered, but she built a life around it. This is what survivors do. They continue. They transform suffering into something that can be borne. They refuse to be erased. And so the freight car sits in memory, not as a monument, but as a question, a reminder that civilization is a thin and fragile thing. That beneath the surface of order and routine lies the possibility of chaos and forgetting. That we are responsible for each other in ways we do not always recognize until the moment of crisis arrives. That the difference between life and death is often nothing more than whether someone remembers you exist. That the greatest evil is not always active cruelty, but passive indifference. That in the end, what saves us is not systems or ideologies, but the simple human act of noticing, of opening the door, of carrying someone to safety, of refusing to look away. The sun rises over the rail yard at Lüneburg. Trains pass carrying goods and passengers. The land has healed and the war is memory. But somewhere in the space between past and present, 12 days in darkness persist. A wooden box, 70 women, the slow erosion of hope, and then, finally, the sound of bolt cutters on metal, the door sliding open, light flooding in, voices calling for help, hands reaching down, the astonishing, impossible fact of rescue, of continuation, of another day and another, stretching forward into a future that once seemed impossible. This is what endures, not the suffering itself, but the stubborn, unreasonable persistence of life. The refusal to disappear, the determination to remember and to be remembered. The freight car is empty now, long since destroyed, but the story remains. And in remaining, it insists that even in the darkest places, even when all seems lost, the possibility of an open door persists. Someone might hear, someone might remember, the light might return. We might survive after all.